Okay, well, my name's Christine Dean, and I've prepared this talk with the help of Catherine, who works with UNSW Galleries. And this has been organised in relation to the exhibition called The Party at UNSW Galleries. Could you raise your hand if you've seen that exhibition? Oh, good. Some of you have. Wonderful. Well, it's on for another week, and it looks at the history of Oxford Street, and particularly the party scene, from approximately 1973 until 2000, I think, around the 2000 mark. So it's worth looking at. It's just, we walked past the art school at the former COFA. We all still call it COFA, don't we? But it's not COFA anymore. Okay, well, so what happens with this talk? We go from here, the Paddington Town Hall, all the way down to where Patches used to be. And so it really, as we go down the hill, literally, it metaphorically goes down the hill in terms of popular culture at large. So literally we look at venues, a whole range of venues, including wine bars, parties where the parties took places, and sex on premises venues. Look, I'm not shy about going through the sex on premises venue thing. You could do a whole thing on sex on premises venues down there, but I think that might be a little bit sort of repetitious or perhaps even monotonous. But that's, horses for courses, really. Okay, well, so we're on Gadigal land, and Oxford Street, the indigenous name is Muru. M-U-R-U, Muru is the indigenous name for Oxford Street. So although most of the talk that I'll be giving will be based on more recent times, it's interesting to take into account the 19th century history of Oxford Street and even the pre-settlement, European settlement history of Oxford Street. So many of the streets in Sydney were indigenous tracks, pathways, and basically they headed east and west, east, west and north, south. So this particular track, which would have gone down to Bondi Beach, South Head, eventually made its way all the way to the Lower Blue Mountains. Parramatta Road was an indigenous highway as well. The roads heading north-south connected Botany Bay and Port Jackson, so Anzac Parade is one of those. So it's important to note that these roads on the ridge lines were indigenous tracks generally. And then this was eventually called South Head Road, then it became Old South Head Road, and around the end of the 19th century it got changed to Oxford Street, and in the early 20th century it was widened and turned into a particular sort of boulevard. I can really recommend looking at a book called Street Scene, published by Gary Wotherspoon and Clive Farrow, which looks at the history of Oxford Street. And in fact, the queer history of Oxford Street goes right back to the mid-19th century, particularly with the rag trade, haberdashery. Young gay men in the 19th century colonial Australia preferred selling corsets and Bombay bloomers than they may have shooting kangaroos or building fences or digging holes somewhere on a farm. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, so it's also called the Golden Mile as opposed to the Glittering Mile. So they're two similar terms not to get mixed up. The Glittering Mile, of course, is King's Cross, and this was referred to as the Golden Mile. And so that's something to take into account. Okay, well, we're starting off here at the Paddington Town Hall, and there are three sort of main venues that I really want to talk about here. And look, I might start off with, I've got some new information on Enzo's Wine Bar, which is that dull green olive building directly over there. See EMS training? There's a little doorway. See that person with the broom? Well, that was the actual doorway to Enzo's Wine Bar, which was upstairs, right there. It was first opened in 1963, but in 1963 it wasn't called Enzo's Wine Bar, it was called Finocchio's. Now, some of you might have heard of the word Finocchio at some point before. And look, I tried to find out who 𝐒𝐿𝐲 was, and it's a bit like asking the question who was 𝐸𝐼nocchio. It was a brand. It was kind of a label, and I'll go into that in a second. So 𝐸𝐼nocchio's, the original one was in San Francisco, and it was in a part of San Francisco called North Beach, and then the Tenderloin. Well, the Tenderloin's part of, you know, San Francisco. Look, I used to go to the Tenderloin as a younger person, and people used to say to me, "You look so relaxed here. This is a really scary, violent place." And I said, "Well, look, it just reminds me of Darlinghurst." If anyone's been to the Tenderloin, it was very much like Darlinghurst. And I say, look, if you get into trouble, just run. And that's the best solution, obviously. So, wine bars, it's interesting to think of the history of alcohol consumption in Australia. It's also interesting to think about the history of drug consumption. We can look at drugs and alcohol and how they affected the whole scene. And obviously LGBT people are sort of notorious for overindulging perhaps in these substances. And that's kind of shaped the character of Oxford Street as well. But basically, in terms of colonial Australia, rum was the first main alcoholic drink. As Robert Hughes said in The Fatal Shore, the early Australian economy was run by three things: rum, sodomy and the lash. Well, some people would say that's still an economy in some parts of Oxford Street. So the rum period was through the 19th century, then beer kicked in, then wine. Wine was very much a 1950s post-war thing. A lot of Australians got themselves in trouble when they started drinking wine because they were drinking it in schooners, literally. They didn't realise the difference in alcohol content. So, you know, Australians really couldn't handle their wine. It was a European thing. But anyway, back to 𝐸𝐻𝐼nocchio's. So 𝐸𝐻𝐼nocchio started as a speakeasy in San Francisco in the late 1920s. And there's an excellent movie, if you want to hear anything about queer San Francisco. It's a movie called Screaming Queens by Susan Stryker. Susan Stryker is a preeminent transgender historian in the US but also internationally. And her argument was that Stonewall was predated by the Compton's cafeteria riots several years earlier. So that's her theory in the movie Screaming Queens. It's on YouTube if you want to have a look at it. Anyway, so 𝐸𝐻𝐼nocchio's was like an all-male revue. It was for drag performances, even in the 1930s. So this was first called 𝐸𝐻𝐼nocchio's in 1963. Then by about 1968, it became 𝐿𝐲's Wine Bar. Why did they choose the name 𝐿𝐲? I tried to find out who 𝐿𝐲 was. I think there were other 𝐿𝐲 bars in the US like 𝐸𝐻𝐼nocchio's, and I think it was just to do with that European sounding name. Think about post-war European immigration, all that sort of thing. And then it became the traffic light. And I think the traffic light was the last sort of iteration of that wine bar, which ended in the later part of the 1980s. So that's one area of significance here. The other spot to point out was the Apollo Bar, which was actually at the back of the Imperial Hotel. We can't see the entrance from here, they're obscured by bushes, but if you just go around the corner, there's a doorway at the side there, and a little old wrought iron balcony, which was the main part of the Apollo. So that was up there, so they were the two venues. And then the third venue was of course the Paddington Town Hall. So the Paddington Town Hall started being used as a venue with the counterculture in the late 1960s. People like Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs were performing there. Then later on, people like Wendy Saddington. And it's really interesting how Wendy Saddington teamed up with another group called Sylvia and the Synthetics. And there's some lovely photographs that I've found with Wendy Saddington and Doris Fish. And they performed together. What a special thing. The entrance, from my memory, to the main sort of ballroom was down further. So let's proceed down here, and now we'll walk down the hill. Okay, so this is where the entrance was to the main sort of party zone. There were some staircases up here, and it was very run down. It's all blocked off now and obscured. But does anyone remember going to parties through this entrance? Joe, you would have gone in through here. So earlier I talked about the history of alcohol in the context of Oxford Street. I'll say a few things about drugs. And it's kind of interesting looking at drugs in relation to music and popular culture. So in the countercultural years of the late 1960s, of course, psychedelics were the thing to have. So they all took acid. And then it switched to things like speed towards the end of the 70s. The punk scene was more associated with speed than psychedelics. Then it went on to ecstasy by the early to mid 80s. Then MDMA. Then eventually crystal meth and other things like that. So stimulants sort of took over. And I suppose the one drug that ran consistently throughout was amyl nitrate. That was obviously the thing, which I'm still shocked at how popular amyl nitrate is today. I think it's had something of a revival, and perhaps people aren't fully aware of the health side effects of these things. So the early queer dances that would take place here were the camp dances and the breakaway Sydney Gay Liberation Group. Sylvia and the Synthetics performed here. And I'll be talking more about Sylvia and Synthetics when we get down to Patches, but let's just refer to them as radical drag, and we'll look at the difference between conventional, highly sort of feminised drag and radical drag as a concept in the late 1970s. The Rat parties were also held here, and bands like 𝐒𝐲𝐻𝐿 and 𝐓𝐿𝐻𝐵 played here as well. So it had sort of many generations, and eventually the Paddington Town Hall became too small for the Mardi Gras parties, and by 1982 they'd all moved to the Hordern Pavilion, mainly because it was an economy of scale, and the sleaze balls were held there from 1982 onwards. Well, let's move down just to Victoria Barracks. Right, well here we are at Victoria Barracks, and Victoria Barracks commenced its being built in the 1840s, and in fact many of the old houses down here were the people that worked here, stonemasons and other things. So really the first village of Paddington was set up just in this area around Gibb Street. And so in Gary Wotherspoon's book, which I can really recommend, called Street Scene, he talks about the relationship between the soldiers here at the Paddington at the barracks to the young men who worked in the haberdashery shops. So they would have been considered rough trade. So there was a bit of traffic between some of the young gay men who worked selling clothing and lingerie or whatever it might be, petticoats, to the men here at the barracks. The reason the barracks were built here was because the soldiers, when they were in Sydney, in Macquarie Street, were becoming quite raucous and were often getting drunk and a bit debauched and all the rest of it. So they thought, well, we better move them out here to the edge of Sydney. This was the edge of Sydney in those days. And it was also useful in the sense, from a military sense, in terms of defence, because it was a relatively easy horse ride to Botany Bay as well as South Head. So strategically it worked too. So that's a little bit of information about the rough trade. So it's interesting to note that the young men who worked on Oxford Street, particularly in the clothing and design, fashion design area of the day, were very much in contact with the men at the barracks. So that's something to note. Another thing to note also about Enzo's Wine Bar was that the interiors were designed by Leslie Walford. And so Leslie Walford, some of you may have met Leslie Walford back in the day. And Leslie Walford was sort of part of a school of interior design in the 1950s and 1960s, often very brightly coloured sort of things, also connected to Florence Broadhurst. And you know all about the murder and the mystery of the unresolved death of Florence Broadhurst down near Trumper Park. Okay, we'll move down. The next two venues we'll talk about are the Unicorn Hotel and some other places further down. Okay, so I just wanted to point to the Unicorn Hotel. So this has had an interesting history. It was originally like the Oxford Hotel, a place where punk bands would play, and then eventually it became a place for the clones. And look, I gave the poor old clones a bad rap last time, and I'm glad no one sort of identifies with one. And by the way, if anyone has any questions along the way or wants to engage in some sort of discussion, please do. Maybe I can do my school teacher question and ask, can anyone sort of outline the fashion tendencies of a clone?
Well, basically, flannelette shirts, jeans and work boots. So yes. Well, I was a proto clone at the time. I mean, I was young and pretty and a bit punk as well. So, and it was a really convenient uniform. I mean,
Sort of the wash
and usually a moustache.
The wash and wear look.
Yeah, the wash and wear look. It was fantastic.
Right.
So,
and then perhaps the flannelette shirts gave way to the white T-shirt, the 501 jeans, and of course the proverbial bandana.
Yes.
The hanky code. Are you all familiar with the hanky code?
Oh yes.
Sorry, I've never heard of it. Some call it gay semiotics.
Yes.
The gay semiotics. And look, the funny thing is, the last time I gave this talk, Trough Man turned up, and he was wearing his yellow bandana, and I made him turn around because I wanted to see which pocket it was in. And from memory, he had it in his right pocket, so that means more active than passive, and I thought it would be in the left pocket. So he left me somewhat perplexed. Maybe his... Oh, you said you didn't know what the yellow bandana referred to? Well...
Urine, dear. Urine.
Urine. It's
Yes.
he sort of pioneered piss play in Australian romantic.
Well, it had always been around, but he did it in public.
He did it in public, absolutely. And you know,
famous for being peed on.
yeah, that's what you know. And
It's a long time ago.
in an interview, he talked about it being a form of intimacy. So I thought that was nice. And then at the end, he said, "Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed your talk," and he put out his hand, and I thought, uh-oh. So I shook his hand, and it was velvety soft. So there's something to be said about that, isn't there? Okay, back to the Unicorn Hotel.
Well, let's just face it. He would have had a shower at least in the last month.
But I think he should really go to some sort of cosmetic company and share his secret. Okay, so back to the Unicorn Hotel. So it had its clone phase as well, and then it became more of a mixed bar in the 1990s. All right, then we'll proceed further down. Hi, Cho. Thanks for coming. And look, in more recent times, most of my life on Oxford Street has been teaching at the National Art School, where I teach art history and theory and painting. I've been teaching there for 15 years. So it sort of made up for my early years on Oxford Street in the 1980s. So at least kind of it went both ways. And look, it's interesting to note that a lot of the history of Oxford Street was all about working class people trying to make a quid, running small businesses like bars and other forms of things. And you know, it's so different to the era we're living in today. I walked past a cafe and there was a Porsche SUV parked out the front here in Paddington. I thought, oh, this place is full of wankers. And you know, certainly the type of people that ran all these venues were just working class people trying to make a buck. And that really characterises the thing.
And also, a lot of people, like me, were born on Oxford Street because Paddington Women's Hospital was just up the road. And so if you were Catholic, you were born at St Margaret's.
I was born in St Margaret's, as was my sister Jo.
Right. Yeah, and if you weren't Catholic, you were Greek Orthodox. They were forced to give birth at Paddington Women. So I was born on Oxford Street.
Yes. Well, certainly on my birth certificate it says place of birth Darlinghurst, so it doesn't even say Sydney, which is quite strange. Okay, so
was Dawn O'Donnell born here?
She was. I think she was born in Paddington, And I'll be talking about Dawn O'Donnell. Look, I've just had a reference to Dawn O'Donnell here, and I've got some notes about Dawn O'Donnell. In fact, the interesting thing is, because you raised Dawn O'Donnell, she lived from 1927 to 2007, and she ran many of the venues here, including Patches, Flows, the Exchange, Ruby's, and also eventually the Newtown Hotel and the Imperial in 𝐸⁻⁻ And it's also interesting to note that the gay scene really didn't spread beyond Oxford Street until the late 1980s. So, you know, we think of Newtown as being part of that world now, but certainly prior to the late 80s, it was very concentrated in this area. In fact,
because Dawn kept on burning places down, or had a reputation for that, or because didn't she have something to do with a place in Bondi Junction suddenly going up in fire, or was that Abe Saffron?
Well, I think it was probably Dawn O'Donnell's henchman. Some people say, what was Dawn O'Donnell? You know, and if you're polite, she was a businesswoman.
Yes.
You know, if you're not polite, you'd say she was an arsonist, because there are at least 4 or 5 fires connected to Dawn O'Donnell, including Ivy's, which we'll be walking past later. So it was a pretty rough scene, and it was quite ruthless. Dawn eventually came to monopolise the scene. In fact, there was another woman by the name of Ivy Richter. And the interesting thing about both Dawn O'Donnell and Ivy Richter, they were both born the same year in 1927, and eventually Ivy was kind of, her business was closed down because Dawn O'Donnell took them over, and there was arson involved. So you're definitely right in saying that. Okay, so what else can I add to that? I think we'll just keep going down, and the next one we'll talk about is the Albury.
20 minutes, please.
Oh, Joe, Tim, I have to say something here. Okay, while we're here at the lovely 𝐓𝐿𝐲𝐻𝐵 bookstore, I'm sure you've been looking here for first edition books and cappuccinos, but it was actually the 3rd iteration of Club 80. So Club 80 ended up here, which was the sex on premises venue. And look, a lot of people want to know all about sex on premises venues, and some people might. Does anyone know the difference between a wet sauna and a dry sauna?
Well, you've got a steam room and a sauna, isn't it?
The showers, presumably.
Yeah.
And what about the? Do you know anything about the wet saunas and the dry saunas?
No, not
Well, you're lucky.
Please tell me.
Well, what about the dry ones? Are there any dry saunas in operation these days? Without showers and without general plumbing? Anyway, I think
you're talking about sex on premises.
sex on premises venues.
Yes.
So Club 80 was notorious. And the other thing about Club 80, there was a police raid here. It was one of the big last police raids before the decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1984. And it was sort of an area that was very touch and go because AIDS had sort of started, and I think the state government under Neville Wran were very worried that AIDS could actually delay the decriminalisation of male homosexuality. So this was a real issue. This was why this building was somewhat controversial, because it was the last police raid. So they raided the building, they found it full of men having sex, and it was closed down. But Club 80 there's a Club 80 in Melbourne now, some people have heard of that one. But it was in 3 places. Originally it started on William Street, then it went
Just behind Kinsela's.
behind Cappricios.
I have been there.
You have been there, and then eventually it came here. So that's something to note. I think last time I gave this talk, I thought this was the 2nd version, and that was the 3rd version. But it's interesting thinking about it all in relation to politics, history, the decriminalisation of male homosexuality, and the whole sort of timeline in the context of AIDS as well. And you can think about, we've just been through a pandemic. You know, the COVID pandemic lasted a couple of years. Well, with AIDS, it was very much like that over a period of a decade at least. So that was how impactful it was in relation to the coronavirus timescale. Okay, the next one we'll be looking at is the Albury, so let's head down here. Okay, so I just wanted to point out the Albury Hotel, which is this building over here, and this opened in 1980, and it was a very stylish gay bar. You know, the decor was of a higher standard. They had a big white grand piano in the corner in the downstairs bar. There were two bars here, a downstairs bar and an upstairs bar. And it was known for tasteful drag, so people like 𝐿𝐼𝐻𝐿𝐼𝐻𝐿 were doing drag performances there. So that was part of it as well. They did a thing called the 𝐂𝐼𝐻𝐿𝐼𝐻𝐿 show, and another one called Polly's Folly. So they were very well choreographed, very organised drag shows. What's the difference between tasteful drag and perhaps non-tasteful drag? Well, drag traditionally, being a female impersonator, was very much about having no facial hair and wearing kind of nicely presented clothing, makeup, hair and the whole thing. And so you can think about lay girls as being in that mould. People like Carlotta, you know, that was all part of tasteful drag. By the late 1970s, and in the advent of the punk movement, radical drag came in, specifically in something called 𝐓𝐿𝐼𝐻𝐿𝐼𝐻𝐿 and the Synthetics. So we'll talk more about them when we get down to Patches. So it became an era of when perhaps even a more gender non-binary approach to drag. Like, they wouldn't be doing hormones or anything like that. Hormones played a part with the more tasteful, sort of feminising aspect of drag. And they would often wear moustaches, mismatch clothing in a genderqueer way. And Danny Aboud was a classic. Some of you might have heard of Danny Aboud, who was the silver in Synthetics. He was a very tall Lebanese guy. William Yang took photographs of Danny Aboud. You can see them there. Anyway, apparently with Danny Aboud, if anyone in the audience was playing up, he'd just get down off the stage and punch them. Well, this general unladylike behaviour is what characterised radical drag in some way. Also, radical drag was connected to the art world, so it was like a Dada performance. Eggs might be thrown, there might be a different sort of exchange between the audience. So hopefully that was a thorough definition of that. Okay. Danny Aboud, yeah. Sadly he died only quite recently, about 18 months ago I think. Okay, back to the Albury. So my favourite time at the Albury was just turning up one night there. It would have been around 1990. There were only about a dozen people there. People just with drinks walking around, and someone was playing the piano, and I looked at the pianist and it was Peter Allen. And he'd obviously come back to Australia for a while, and it was very kind of low-key, casual. He must have known the people running the bar. And then sadly he went back to America and died not long afterwards. So does anyone have any memories of the Albury?
Yes.
What are your memories?
Well, that was one of the first places I went to when I started being social, and I started going to the Albury Hotel from 1985, and it was a lot of fun. And what they would do, they would have drag queens, they'd clear the bar, and the drag queens would do the drag shows on the bar, which you couldn't do nowadays because of occupational health and safety, but they would literally, it was like a Wild West saloon, and they'd be dancing all around the bar. And then there was the piano bar as well, which was great, very cabaret, yeah.
So as far as drag goes, I suppose we talked about Colleen Windsor, she was one of them, she's still around. Monique Kelly, I think, was performing there as well. And this was all part of the tasteful drag thing. You can look these people up. I'll just make just a quick remark about the Beauchamp Hotel. So like a lot of the venues, when the Albury became too busy, this was like the flow over crowd that all sort of congregate here. So it was sort of a gay bar on and off, sometimes referred to as the Beauchamp. I'm sure you've used the Beauchamp terminology. And so after the Albury closed down, this kind of took over a lot of the clientele for a while anyway. All right,
It was named after Lord Beauchamp, who was a gay lord, I understand, in the early 20th century.
That's a good point. I don't think it was done deliberately, though. Do you think?
No.
Because, often enough, people's... but that's a really good point. I'll have to include that in my narrative. Okay, let's keep going down. But we're talking about all the very different eras. Whether you talk about the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. Okay, I'll just make a few points here about the bookshop.
And accommodation, that's a good and also, it's really that people going and I rooted in habit. So I had a bit of interest in it. 254?
Oh yes, 254. Thank you. Look, I know that it was around the back, wasn't it?
Yes. We used to get amused at the front door, entrance and rear.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so I've just wanted to say that there was another sauna around the back here, 254. But look, you could do a whole talk about the history of saunas. And what era was that running from, do you think?
That would have been 70s to 80s sometime. It was still around in the 80s, but I've never been there. I didn't know anyone who went there, so we just knew about it.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so here we are at the bookshop, Darlinghurst, and it formerly was called Exiles. And, it's kind of sad to think about why was it called Exiles. It opened in 1980, and it really indicates that a lot of gay men thought of themselves as being exiled from the broader community at large, moving to Darlinghurst and coming to a place like this. So it used to be 2 levels, and they used to have a lot of art exhibitions upstairs. So if you look at the back there's like a staircase that goes up, and it was kind of like a pop-up space after that. But certainly some of the earliest gay art exhibitions in Sydney took place up there. And it very much models itself off famous bookstores like the Oscar Wilde bookshop in New York, which started in 1967. So there were gay bookshops in different parts of the world, and it's a miracle that it's still running. Okay, let's proceed further down now. Here we have another venue which was called Ivy's, or Ivy's Birdcage, and it was run by Ivy Richter. And Ivy Richter lived from 1927 to 2013, so she died at 1985. And there's a thing on the internet called the Pride History Group. John Whitty interviewed her towards the end of his life, and it's a wonderful interview if you feel like listening to Ivy Richter and her story and all the rest of it. It's all very interesting. Once again, this was another venue that got burnt down. She started here in 1969, and it really only lasted for a few years. Prior to that, she'd been running a similar establishment, 𝐂𝐲𝐼y in Bondi Junction. And one of the things I picked up from her interview was she would take in a lot of young gay men, young gay boys who would be thrown out of the family home, and their fathers didn't like them and all the rest of it. And they'd come here, and she was almost like their mother. She'd take them in. So where she lived, she'd often have spare bedrooms above her place, and they'd stay there and live there for a while. The way they got into drag, she used to do drag shows here. And one of the things that Dawn O'Donnell said famously, and this is a quote from the documentary actually, called Crocodile Dundee, if you've seen that. Dawn O'Donnell said, "I love drag queens because they make me a lot of money." And really, it was a way of making money on the cheap. It was sort of a form of the spectacle or popular entertainment. Anyway, as Ivy Richter said in her interview, the young guys would come and stay with her, and the way she'd get them into drag, she used to have a bunny show. They have to wear bunny outfits, like leotards and tails and everything. And if they kind of took to that, then they could graduate into being drag queens. Isn't that an interesting little observation? So that's that about Ivy's Birdcage. Someone in the last talk said to me, don't forget to say that it was named after 𝐒𝐲𝐿, And then I was listening to the interview, and what Ivy Richter seemed to indicate was that 𝐒𝐲𝐻𝐼 was named after Ivy's birdcage. It went the other way around. So if you see photographs of it, there were all these old bird cages hanging up with little fake birds in it, and apparently people would come to Oxford Street. It was on sort of the books at the time, the Spartacus guides or whatever, and so it's a great case of life imitating art. So here we are at Flinders Street, and I'll just make a point of a few other venues. The Taxi Club, which was just down here on the left. Some of you might have gone to the Taxi Club, an unusual venue, started in 1956, and it was a late night venue. So there were a couple of venues on Oxford Street that the licenses allowed them to go a lot later. You might remember it was almost run like an RSL. They had membership and a funny little desk at the front and all the rest of it. And they were allowed to stay open, I think, usually till about 4 a.m, as was Flo's Palace, which we'll talk about Flo's later. So that's where the crowd would go. The other thing about the Taxi Club, it was famous for a meeting place between rough trade and drag queens or transgender women. So, you know, there's a new name for this in the history, the lexicon of queer terminology, and it's the word ambisexual, which is a bit like the word ambidextrous. Ambisexual, does anyone use the word ambisexual as part of their vocabulary? Well, here's the word for you. How do you use it? You went to the book launch. Okay. Could you provide us with the definition of the term?
Well, if someone is ambisexual, that means that they're attracted to people that are transgender, regardless of the transgender person's physical state, or whether they've got their original plumbing or not.
So it's a bit like the word ambidextrous, and it does add a whole other layer to the queer scene, doesn't it? In terms of gender binaries, gay, lesbian, male, female, whatever. Okay, so the Taxi Club was something which was quite special, really. It's a shame it closed. And it
There's
closed
a very
in...
funny photo that appeared on Facebook a couple of days ago of the Pope going past the Taxi Club, blessing it, in 1985.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, look, I've often said about senior members of the Catholic Church, they look great in their long dresses, don't they? Like, if that's not a form of drag, I don't know what is. And, okay, so when the Taxi Club closed down in 2012, a lot of the clients went to Kinsella's. So Kinsella's, as you would obviously know, was formerly a funeral parlour, and the interior is rather unusual. They've kept the decor and everything, and obviously that's still being run as the gay bar as well. But yeah, a lot of the drag shows and the trans, the cross dressers, the whole sort of spectrum of gender variants went over to Kinsella's. Okay, two other things to note further down here were the Beresford and the Flinders Hotel. So they were also gay bars, and they were more known for rough trade. There was an organisation called the SPMC, the South Pacific Motor Club. Some of you might have heard of them, and they were like the gay leather men. Like, I always found interesting about the gay leather men that they prefer the texture and touch of leather to skin. I always found that a bit strange, but anyway, that's just my take on it. And the Dolphin Club was also there with the SPMC, so that was down here on Flinders Street. So you were saying the Beresford, what street is that in? Burke Street. Okay, so that's just one back here. Yeah, and also this building here on the corner has had something of history as well. And I seem to remember there was like a leather bar, like some sort of dungeon underneath.
The barracks.
The barracks, that's right. And they had that spider web chain thing where people would get chained up and all that sort of thing. That was more of a 90s phenomenon, I'd say, the barracks. And then obviously that came and went. Okay, while we're here, I'll just point out the Oxford Hotel, which is directly opposite here, and then we'll cross Taylor Square. Also, it's important to note that the famous Hordern Pavilion is down here. And if you look at the history of the Mardi Gras, it's important to note two differences in the early Mardi Gras. Until about 1980, they generally went down Oxford Street rather than up, and they were held in winter rather than summer. And that was because of Stonewall in America. you know, they were commemorating the July Stonewall riots of 1969, approximately a decade earlier. And then eventually, so that now the parade goes down Flinders Street and eventually to the Hordern Pavilion, where the party still goes on. Okay, the Oxford Hotel on the corner, just there, has been a gay bar since 1980. And prior to 1980, it was a punk venue. Believe it or not, that's where all the punk music scene sort of kicked off. I was talking about Radio Birdman. There was even another all-women's band called the Electric Fans, which were a female punk band that often played with Radio Birdman. And they called it the Fun House after some reference to Iggy Pop. So that was the general vibe. And, you know, but putting punks and queers together was, in a way, kind of a bad thing because of the violence. You know, there's often violence involved. Although it is interesting to note that there was a queer punk movement within that, which sort of morphed into the new age sort of thing. All right, well, let's cross Taylor Square and we'll go down further.
Chris, you haven't mentioned Harden and Johnson on the right down there.
God. Okay, he's making reference to a Chrysler dealership. Yeah, well, that's a whole other story. Another place I'd like to point to is the Wall. So the Wall was just down there in Darlinghurst Road, next to the National Arts School, and that was where people would go to meet young male prostitutes. So that was sort of on for many years, and that was part of the scene, and many of them were very young, you know, famously underage, I suspect. And all right, let's cross here. I might just say something about Stonewall.
They still use the...
That's a real old one, that one. That's been there for years. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll just say something about Stonewall. I mentioned Stonewall earlier. Many of you would have heard all about the Stonewall riots in New York City, which was very much a turning point in Western understanding of the gay movement. But it's interesting to note in Weimar, Germany in the 1920s, they actually had the first queer protest in 1923. So it really predated Stonewall by decades in Germany of that time. And so this was named after, look, I'm looking at that thing, 𝐓𝐿. That's kind of an interesting spelling as well. So the pink triangle was used by the Nazis to put on the uniforms of gay men. It's important to note that 50,000 gay men died in concentration camps during World War II in Germany. And this pink triangle predated the rainbow flag. So if you look at old photographs of the 78 Mardi Gras, they were carrying this sort of note-tip. This particular thing should be in a museum, actually. This is quite historic, and you know, I'd be putting that in the archive in Melbourne. It probably dates from the 1980s. Then, while we've got them here, look at the Progress Pride flags. Do you all know the difference between the sort of traditional Pride flag and the Progress flag, what the different colours imply? Well, you can see the transgender flag at the top, which is the white, the pink and the blue, and then the Philadelphia flag, which makes reference to race, brown and black. So that sort of is an attempt to make the rainbow flag more inclusive. Also across the road there is palms, and there's a really interesting piece of There's Palms. Where is Palms? Can anyone see it? Where is it? It's just there.
Below adult
behind
world.
it. And there's a really interesting piece of neon signage there which also should go in the museum because it's quite precious. So Palms is sort of another one from that period. Okay, let's just go down to Cappricios and we'll finish up the talk at the bottom of Oxford Street. Former venue of Cappricios. And if you go across the street, it's actually quite a grand building. It's one of the grander buildings here on Oxford Street. If you look at the history of the buildings, you'll notice on that side of the buildings, they're all a lot newer than this side. See, these ones here were built around 1918. So all the Victorian buildings on that side of Oxford Street were demolished and the street was widened. So this is something which really changed the effect of Oxford Street, whereas this is a much older building, probably dating from 1880s. So Cappricios opened in 1969, and I think it closed around 1983, so that just gives you a time scale. It certainly catered for a particular crowd. Often it was to do with age, like gay men of a certain age would come here, and whereas a younger crowd, to my memory, would go down to the Exchange and Patches where we'll finish the talk. So when I say older guys, I mean people over 30, you know, that's sort of... and when you're very young, you know, they seem ancient when they're over 30, don't they? So they used to have drag shows here. It was a very sort of well-organised, large place. And this is where eventually Club 80, or the second iteration of Club 80, was at the back of this building in the early 1980s as well. Okay, well, let's keep going further down. I have. I have. Now, Peat's Beat was just down there, wasn't it? Yeah. Look, really tiny. Yeah, really tiny. We'll talk about Peat's Beat. Is there anything I'm missing here? No.
Another place.
Flows is further down.
Flows.
Yeah, we'll go down to the next block. Oh, and what about the midnight shift? That's further down too. Well, I'll just make reference to a few points here. Here we've got the Columbian Hotel, which really didn't start as a gay bar until the 1990s. There's obviously a bank at one stage. It looks like sort of bank sort of architecture. And really my only connection to this is when they do a thing called Trans Glamoure, which takes place upstairs, which is for the transgender community and transgender admirers. So if you are in that category, that's where to go. Another place that I'd like to make reference to down here on Crown Street, it was Ruby's, which was a very famous lesbian nightclub, and it was just down here on the right. It became headquarters and now it's called Trade. Some of you might have heard of Trade. And headquarters, so it's just basically down there. It was Ruby's from 1976 till 1986. And it's really interesting and sort of sad in a way how the sort of gay and lesbian community, men and women, were so divided, and that most of the lesbian venues were taking place in the inner west around Petersham and Leichhardt, although for a decade Ruby's, or Ruby Reds as it was known, was just down there on the right. And look, I have done tours of Oxford Street in the past in different sort of eras. When it was headquarters, I remember taking a group down there one hot summer's day, and the door was open and I said, look, take a deep breath. And they were kind of, well, they were young people, but they were straight people, and they were people that I worked with when I was at UTS. And I said, take a deep breath, and they all took a deep breath. And I said, that is the smell of yesterday's cum and a spilt bottle of amyl nitrate. It was quite disgusting. So that was headquarters down there. And if I had a contribution to Australian poetry, that would be it, folks. Eventually Ruby's went to another venue in Surrey Hills near the corner of Cleveland and Elizabeth Street. And I remember going there at one stage. Look, it was very much the era of lesbian separatism, so they were quite specific about who they liked and who they didn't. I think that crowd would find it difficult today, and that really brings up the whole turf thing, you know, but that's another conversation altogether. But I do remember they had these dykes on bikes were there on stage, the motorcycles came on, and they did this lovely number, Leader of the Pack, which was quite memorable at the second iteration of Ruby's. there as well. Okay, well, we're coming down to the last thing. I might say something about flows. Peat's Beat. So across the street here, see where that gold sign is where it says tattoo? That was a little venue called Peat's Beat. And if you look through the glass door, you can see a very steep wooden staircase that went down. They used to do drag shows. Apparently they were very risque, sort of near naked drag shows. They had a plexiglass disco floor that was lit there as well. And one of the sad things is one of the performers there, quite well known, called Wendy Wayne, was murdered. You know, you often hear about the gay murders in Sydney. One thing about the transgender murders, if you're transgender and you get murdered, you don't even have to leave your own home. And sadly with Wendy Wayne, she was living in a flat on Darlinghurst Road. She got shot in the flat, and it's an unsolved murder for this day. And she died in 1985, performing at Peat's Beat. Okay, so it's worth looking in the window, and in the door there you can see what it looks like. Okay, the last sort of main venues we'll be talking about are Flo's Palace, the Oxford Hotel, and Patches, just further down Oxford Street. One place that I want to visit was Flo's Palace. Look, as Rex Mossop liked to say, I'm having one of those deja vu experiences all over again. If you remember who Rex Mossop was. Actually, Rex Mossop was known for his cruising, but that's a whole other story, folks. Okay, so certainly this does remind me of when I did the talk of the rather rank odour of the sex on premises venues. But this used to be Flo's Palace. Once again, another very small venue, a late night venue that had a licence that went on until 4 a.m. when the clubs closed down. It was run by Dawn O'Donnell, and the manager, why it's called Flo's, was Dennis Flo Fuller. That was his name. And once again, watch out for this person. He's interviewed as well, and Dennis Flo Fuller was, you know, another queer who was quite a marginalised character. He worked as a window dresser, all that sort of thing. Think about the sort of employment that LGBT people had. Very limited employment opportunities back then, particularly even with transgender women. Transgender women could only have two jobs: sex work and entertainment. So it was very limited as well. Okay, we'll head further down Oxford Street now to the last two venues, the Exchange Hotel and Patches, and that's where the tour will end.
Midnight Shift.
Oh, of course, the Midnight Shift. Okay, we'll go to the Midnight Shift. Okay, I'll say a few things about the Midnight Shift. So we talked earlier about the clones and the Unicorn Hotel. So the Midnight Shift was very sort of hyper-masculine. Look, one of the things about it, which really doesn't wear well, is it was almost like male separatists. So they didn't like women coming into a place like this. So really, it's kind of sad that that was the case.
Their homophobic boyfriends with them. And so yes, so it was really necessary for there to be LGBT only places much more, because we were coming to the point of assimilation, but not at that stage, because it was still really dangerous. So it was really necessary to know that the guy that you're smiling at isn't going to punch your face in. So that's why places like this were really important. They still are.
Well, it's very much a period piece, and it's really good now. Things are a lot more mixed and complex, perhaps.
Yes.
Okay.
And also, sorry, Paul Keating came here.
Oh, that's interesting.
No, I'm serious, with some friends one night.
Well, there you go. Well, Paul Keating, there's a whole history of Paul Keating that we don't know about, isn't there? So the Midnight Shift started in 1980 and ran to 2017. And it was sort of a hyper-masculine bar. Often, as I mentioned, the clones were very sort of big here. They also had drag shows here. And unfortunately, the reason it closed down was because of the lockout laws of 2017. Now, I'm not sure what you think about the lockout laws, whether they were a good thing or a bad thing, but certainly as a resident of King's Cross, being able to sleep on a Friday and Saturday night was a good thing, so it quietened everything down. But this certainly was one of the sort of victims of the lockout laws. Does anyone have any other stories about the midnight shift beside Paul Keating? You said the dance floor was...
The dance floor was one of the best in
memorable?
Sydney, so yes, really great music, really excellent atmosphere, and yes, the men were really hot. Mostly clothes and bears. And,
Well, the Bears have had a
when I
life.
wasn't, but hey.
The Bears have had a life of their own too.
Yes.
In more recent times. I'm not sure where the Bears go these days. Does anyone know?
The Oxford Hotel.
I'm not really up on the Bears, unfortunately. Anyway, all I can say is half their luck. All right, now we'll go down to the last two, and then we'll be done. Look, with rough trade, we're often perceived to be heterosexual men, and whereas trade would just be general kind of people, men that you'd pick up.
Yeah.
So
A more masculine.
yeah, hyper-masculine, yeah. But particularly rough trade, there was some sort of danger involved, because if you were kind of going with a person who was bi, or you know, like a man who has sex with men but not gay
Doesn't
identified,
identify.
yeah, that's where all that, oh, here we go. So yeah, that's my sort of understanding of that. And so here we've reached our last port of call, everyone. And I'll just point out the last two venues on the list. This one here was Patches. So see this red texture brick building here? In fact, if you look closely, you can still see some of the neon signage, these neon circles that are up there, and there's a rainbow flag. So that sort of designates Patches. And Patches ran from 1975 until 1989. Then it became another nightclub called Diva, which only ran for a year in 1989. And then it became DCM from 1990 to 2009. So it had three sort of iterations. As I mentioned earlier, it was the home of performers like Sylvia and the Synthetics, who were the radical drag. We've talked about the difference between radical drag and other things. It was also very much part of an avant-garde. So think about the Oxford Art Factory, if anyone's been there, and the sort of art performance that goes on here. It was very much a precursor to that. Also, a lot of the people that performed here, people like Miss 3D, Cindy Pastel and Legs Galore, as well as Teresa Green, were performing in Stranded. So it had a kind of avant-garde feel about it. And look, I was reading up on Legs Galore recently. What an interesting story that is. You know, a very interesting person who came here from the Caribbean, sadly died of AIDS in the early 90s, all that sort of thing. One of the great stories I like about Patches was Phyllis Diller came here and performed. And apparently what happened when Phyllis, some of you may not know who Phyllis Diller was. You haven't heard of Phyllis? Okay, you've heard of Joan Rivers? Well, Phyllis Diller was like the spiritual mother of Joan Rivers. She was sort of where that sort of approach was based, if that makes sense. Anyway, Phyllis Diller had this sort of mixed up makeup, kind of a big white sort of hairstyle which looked like a wig, and she had this sort of funny Brooklyn accent, and she was a bit on the rough side, you know, comedian essentially, in the 1960s. And she's very much connected to feminism, so she was a star. You know, think of the same era as Tiny Tim, these sort of quirky kind of people. Anyway, so Phyllis Diller actually came here, and apparently, according to people I've spoken to, it set into train a whole lot of Phyllis Diller impersonators. And this is part of the radical drag, thinking about how you can appropriate from popular culture and how you can have some sort of edge to what you're doing in a more kind of artistic and theatrical way. So that's a little bit about that. People like Bill Morley was a DJ here. Bill Morley, a very famous DJ, and some of his work's been recreated in the Party exhibition. Look, Bill Morley, I met him and he was such an interesting character. You know, he DJ'd all of the early Mardi Gras and famously did the Blue Danube at 3 a.m. at, I think, the 1987 or 88 Mardi Gras, and I think I remember being there at the time. So he was very much agent provocateur, let's put it that way. Stephen Hawkins was also a DJ here, and apparently he's still DJing. So it was very avant-garde, new wave, and quite sort of progressive. Okay, now when this bus sort of moves, the final venue that I'm going to talk about is the Exchange Hotel. And the Exchange Hotel is the building just over there. Now look, it's very run down and looking quite sad at the moment. And that used to be a very glamorous bar. In fact, there were two bars. There was one on the downstairs level where it had saddles at the bar. Some of you might remember the saddles. It was called Saddle Traps or Saddle Tramps. And then another bar upstairs with all the mirrors, and it was very sort of pokey. Look, I passed out there one night, and it had a lack of oxygen, and I confess I had a sniff of some amyl nitrate, and the oxygen levels in these places, you know, I felt like the canary in the coal mine, literally. So it was once again where sort of the younger crowd would go, and when they'd finish off at the Exchange, then they'd go to Patches. So there was sort of an exchange through there, and it ran as a gay bar for many years. I'm just trying to work out how many years, probably around 30 years from the late 1970s onwards. Sadly, the building's in such poor condition, the roof has collapsed, see the scaffolding up there? So the roof has come down. And just last thing I want to point out here, you know, in terms of fire and the drama of Oxford Street, I was driving down here a week or so ago, and I noticed Oxford Street was blocked off, and there was a fire brigade here, and there was a fire up in that apartment at the top there. See all the black smoke and everything? So they had to block off. The fireys had trouble accessing that apartment, which, you know, burnt down, and so Oxford Street was blocked off at that time. Okay, well, I think that's perhaps all I can say about it. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Did you know Marilyn came to the Exchange? And there was a story, perhaps someone can tell?
She got
Young
punched up.
Marilyn or Marilyn Monroe?
Marilyn, the
Boy
George's friend. Yeah, you know what, can you tell us what happened?
Oh, I think she ended up in a scuffle in the Exchange Hotel. Someone roughed her up. And there was a photo of her sitting outside on a milk crate looking really defeated. So Marilyn was a sidekick of Boy George.
Yeah. Well, Marilyn was Boy George's partner at one stage. And the other thing is too, Boy George would have come to all of these venues. And you know, that's the thing about the Australian discos. They were always sort of part English but part American. You know, they had different eras, different influences. I think Patches was more English than American. It had that sort of Brit pop, sort of proto-punk kind of attitude. And also, you know, I talked about Rex Mossop earlier. There was a very interesting, I think it was on one of the daytime, was it Mike Walsh? It wasn't Mike Walsh, it was one of those programs from that era. I'll think about it in a minute.
Paul Hogan?
No, it wasn't Paul Hogan. It could have been Don Lane. Yeah, I think it could have been Don Lane, that sort of era, where there was a real altercation between Boy George and Rex Mossop.
Oh, Ray Martin.
Was it Ray Martin?
Yes.
Okay, well there you go. All right, well, any other questions about Oxford Street?
I think Julie Clary also stirred quite a bit.
Oh yes, Julie
Politicians,
Clary. Yeah, that's right. Well, it was an era when, you know, people like Boy George, Julian Clary, Marilyn were coming out here, and they were sort of seen by conservative politicians as troublemakers, and they were kind of inciting riot. And it was still in an era when, you know, the Fred Niles ruled supreme. And so I think in the last talk that I gave, I did ask the crowd, what was your favourite Mardi Gras float from the history of the Mardi Gras? And certainly we all tended to agree Fred Niles' Head on a Platter, circa 1988, I think that was 88. So, you know, it was, they were obviously seen as being a morally corrupting force.
Yeah, and also you forgot to mention, right next door to the Exchange Hotel was the famous Sydney sauna that used to be called Kingston, and that's still there.
Well, I think when you give the talk here on Oxford Street, Yanni, you're going to focus specifically on gay male saunas.
Oh, great. Okay.
Which you would do to great aplomb.
Part of our history.
And in just another note, if you follow the axis down further, there's another one here which some people go to, which is almost their church, their religion. It's called 357. And look, I've never been to 357, but I hear a lot about it And one day I'm going to write a book called 357 Diaries about all the stories I've heard about 357. But that's further down there, I presume. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and I hope you all got something out of that talk. Thank you.